All right, we have last session before lunch break. We have another speaker from Bayern. Servus.
Grüß dich.
Grüß dich. Wieso bist denn du nicht mit der Lederhosen gekommen?
Ja, ist auf der Wiesn.
Ist auf der Wiesn, yeah. So I was just asking him, for those that don't speak German, why he's not here in the Lederhosen. I think he lost it on the Wiesn, on the Oktoberfest. So one of the things when I always try to speak with my speakers and say, hey, what can I tell the audience on why they should stay here and not already escape? And you said, sell them free clusters. It means what you are going to show us later on is how people here can actually get some free clusters.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing is, what you also give away for free is I heard that you have a podcast. It's called Tools for the Craft.
Yes.
Perfect. So, folks, I think giving back to the community works in different ways, and it's great to have somebody here that not only does the speaking here, but also has a podcast. I know there's many opportunities out there for you to get educated, but keep these new channels in mind for those of you that are listeners to podcasts. One more to add to the list, and I think you have it in your slides later on again. Last, before I let you speak, as always, if you have questions, we will have 5 minutes in the end. Katharina now will be the mic runner to then make sure that all of your questions get answered. And if we run out of time, then there's lunch break, and I'm pretty sure you will be around. But
Absolutely.
With this, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so first things first, can you hear me or am I too loud? Awesome. So of course I'm here to give you free clusters and also going to talk about Rabbitholes and virtualized Kubernetes clusters. I hope you're here to learn about virtualized Kubernetes because I know next to nothing about rabbits. First things first, here's some information about me. I work at a company called Blueshoe based in Munich. There's a nice pre-COVID picture of me. I much more look like this nowadays, so if you want to find me, just get in touch with me. Or if you don't want to personally get in touch, you can also write me an email, find me on LinkedIn, on GitHub. But yeah, let's just dive right into the rabbit hole. So at our company, at first, we did not know that we look at virtualized Kubernetes clusters. But we just dove in and realized we provide some staging systems for our customers, which basically run 24/7. Well, actually, the need is like a couple of days per week. So we think about costs. And we also think about, well, if we want to dynamically provision our staging systems, this should be an effortless task. I don't want to sit there and click something in Amazon or Google or whatever and wait some 10 minutes, 15 minutes until this cluster is ready. And then think about how do I provision my workloads and provide a state. So I also want something which is here in the bubble of shelf. We want to save the state of this cluster so we can spin it up again later. We can delete our cluster, we can pre-provision it again when we need the staging system. And thinking about those things, we realized that also our developers might profit from this. Because not everybody ticks like me, we do Kubernetes, I dive right in, but some software developers, quote unquote, just want to develop software and don't want to become Kubernetes specialists. At Blueshoe, we adhere to the shift left model, so we want our developers to work on Kubernetes as early as possible. We don't want to be in the situation of, well, it works on my Docker Compose setup, why doesn't it work in Kubernetes? But again, the software developer who doesn't want to become a Kubernetes expert will really profit from some form of easy user interface, some easy thing that provides them with a Kubernetes cluster with hopefully zero configuration, maybe even a platform where they have a one-click solution to provide them with a development cluster. We do this, as I said, to adhere to the shift left model and also to achieve high dev prod parity. And of course, we can also look at performance. If I run Kubernetes locally on my laptop, I might run into performance issues depending on the setup, on the number of clusters I want to run there. And also, we might use different laptops, different operating systems. What works on my machine might not especially work well on your machine. So probably my development cluster runs somewhere in the cloud. which comes back to the costs aspect. If my development cluster runs 24/7, and now I'm a couple of days on the KCD Austria, I pay 2 days of cluster for no work at all. So also on my development cluster, I want to store the state to be able to delete my development clusters and in a couple of days to spin them up again. And of course, on cloud clusters, we have the collaboration aspect. If a colleague of mine needs some help with their Kubernetes setup, it is much more easier for me to help when I have access to that cluster and not do it in some form of video call. So yeah, as I've said, I know next to nothing about Rabbit, so I just hope this looks somewhat similar like a Rabbithole looks. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about virtual Kubernetes clusters. What I mean when I talk about that. Basically, we want to run Kubernetes inside a Kubernetes host cluster, which has the main advantage that the host cluster provides all the infrastructure. It probably has a node autoscaler, and my virtualized Kubernetes cluster that's running in that host cluster doesn't have to provide the infrastructure, so it can be enabled very quickly. And also we deal with ephemeral clusters, so meaning short-living and non-durable Kubernetes clusters. I want to be able to easily and quickly provision a full dev setup for a short time. Our developers need to start from a proven and consistent baseline. Also, as I've talked about, our temporary staging systems would be nice, and essential is to easily and quickly store and restore the cluster state. We can also think about some CI scenarios. So if I have the state of my cluster stored, I can spin it up in automated tests and run my tests against that, which is very nice. And the last point I want to leave you here is the pet versus kettle analogy. If I have, for example, my dedicated cloud development cluster, this thing is very, very precious for me. If it doesn't run for some reason, somebody needs to fix this as quickly as possible, whereas my virtualized Kubernetes cluster is more on the kettle side. If this thing is broken, I can just delete it and spin it up again. Now, to look at some solutions that provide Kubernetes and Kubernetes clusters, virtualized Kubernetes clusters, you obviously will find vCluster, the biggest player on the market. They run virtual clusters in regular namespaces. However, their workloads run in the host cluster, so they have some form of syncer component. Your pods in your virtual cluster will be synced to the host cluster, and they achieve multi-tenant Kubernetes with that. At Blueshoe, that did not really suit all our needs, so we developed our own tool called GetDeck, which runs fully isolated virtual clusters, so there is no syncing to the host cluster. We can easily and quickly create and delete remote clusters with GetDeck, and the killer feature, we can easily store and restore the cluster state. Just to give you a few points about GetDeck, it is an open source tool. You can find it on GitHub, also on the homepage getdeck.dev. We will look at that in a minute. It's basically a Kubernetes operator written with the Kopf framework. So as of that, it's kind of vendor agnostic. It does not matter where your host cluster lives, if it's an Amazon cluster, Google, Azure, if it's some form on Hetzner with Q1, whatever, you just need to install the GetDeck operator in there. We use 2 custom resource definitions, one to manage the virtual clusters and one to manage the so-called shelves to store the state of a cluster. And it also comes with 3 tools, one a CLI, the Byboat CTL, which is probably for the more advanced users, the Kubernetes specialists, an API and a desktop app, which hopefully provides this one-click solution where I can say, well, I want this cluster now. And yeah, now coming to the free clusters part, our company, Blueshoe, is currently providing the free GetDeck service offering. The information you can find on the homepage. We will look at that in a second. You need the GetDeck desktop app for that. You can register directly via the desktop app, and you get a maximum of 1 cluster at a time, which lives for 4 hours. So after that, it will be automatically deleted. But hey, free clusters, yay! So yeah, let's just look at that. Let's see GetDeck in action. I'm just gonna head over to the homepage. If you want to try out the free service, you can click on the quick start button, see the information and get started here, and see some steps that walk you right through it, which will be my live demo. So I already have the desktop app here. I can register for a new account. Let's use KCD Austria. And use a password. And now I'm registered, I'm already logged in. This is what the desktop app looks like. Not much going on at the moment. I can just click on create a cluster. I can specify the cluster name. It will be KCD Austria. I want 3 nodes, and I could also specify some more ports if I want a port on my localhost map, which I don't need for the demo. So I'm just gonna click on create. And we see now the table looks a little bit different. Here is our cluster, KCD Austria. It was in the state requested. Now it's already in the state pending. We also see some specs like the lifetime, the 4 hours I just mentioned, and a timeout of 5 minutes. So if you don't use your cluster, if you don't connect with your cluster within 5 minutes, it will also be automatically deleted. This is a thing for the free GetDeck service offering. Of course, if you're running it, if you're hosting it yourself, you can tweak the parameters to your liking. And in the meantime, our cluster became ready. So that was like, I don't know, half a minute or a minute. And now I'm ready to use this cluster. And to use this cluster, there are a few actions available. I can click on connect. Now there's a little message down there informing me that I can just click right here down to the bottom right and copy the kubeconfig, and I'm gonna head over to my terminal. I'm gonna paste what's copied here, and now I have a kubeconfig for this virtual Kubernetes cluster, meaning I can interact with it with kubecontrol, with any Kubernetes tool you like, just with any other Kubernetes cluster. So we can just list our nodes, and we see we have our 3 nodes, a server and 2 agent nodes. And what I now want to do is apply some workload in there. I prepared a little script for that. I'm gonna create a namespace called spacecrafts to install an app which is called spacecrafts. It's just a little demo application. I can use Helm install. We see 2 warnings at the moment that the Kubernetes, the kubeconfig is group and world readable. This is something we will obviously fix. We have done the Helm install. I'm just gonna head into K9s. Maybe you're familiar with that. And we see 2 pods coming up, a spacecraft's PostgreSQL and the spacecraft's application pod. As I've mentioned, this is a very simple demo application, which also does not have some form of readiness probes. So we just have to wait a little moment until the Postgres pod is ready and our application pod is ready. I will use this to modify the state of the application. So in a moment, I will drop into a shell, into a bash, into the container. It is a Django app, so I'm gonna drop into the Django management shell and create just another model instance. So now our container is starting again because it couldn't reach the database. Postgres pod is ready, so our container should become ready any second now. It reports it is running, and so let's just drop in there. Let's head to the shell plus. This app has a model called component. We can just look, there are some components, they are provided with a fixture, and we can create a new component. I'm gonna copy this real quick. And the component will just be named, oh, I was dropped out of the container. I'm not really sure why. Maybe let's drink a sip of water and wait for a second. Now it's ready. I probably should have waited for that. We can look at the components again. And we can create our component, which has the title KCD. So this has been created. I can list my components, and I can see the component right here named KCD. So this is just the demonstration of a state I've modified. I've written something in the database. I'm gonna drop out of the container and gonna close this, and I'm gonna switch my terminal. This kubeconfig now is connected with the host cluster, and I'm gonna show you the CLI tool, bytectl. We can look at the clusters, and we see it's unfortunately split in multiple lines, but here is the cluster name. And what I want to do is create a shelf to store the state of the cluster. So I'm gonna hit bytectl, shelf create. I'm gonna paste the UUID and provide the shelf name, and it should be just KCD Austria. And the shelf is being requested. I can look at the progress by listing my shelves, and I see there's a short list. Right at the top, there's KCD Austria. It's in the state pending. In the background, we use the Kubernetes volume snapshotting API. So our virtual cluster is running pods, is running stateful sets with persistent volumes in the host cluster, and these are getting snapshotted, which stores our state. Our shelf is now ready. So what I can now do, we have spun up a cluster, we have applied some workload, we have modified the state, and we can now just delete this cluster because we don't use it anymore. I'm gonna hit disconnect, and I'm gonna hit delete. Now the cluster is gone with our precious state from the database, and now I'm gonna use bytectl to spin up a new cluster, which is bytectl cluster create. Gonna name it KCD restore, gonna use the flag from shelf and specify KCD Austria. Now we see the CLI part, what we previously seen in the desktop app. Unfortunately, the shelf feature is currently not supported in the desktop app. We are working on that. It will come soon. So currently, I need to interact with the bytectl to create shelves and to restore a cluster from this shell. We see our cluster is now still in a state restoring, but it should become ready any second now. It's already in the state pending. In the background, as I've mentioned, we use the Kubernetes volume snapshotting API. So we use this, we fetch this, the stored snapshot and pre-provision the persistent volumes for that. And now our cluster became ready in 46.2 seconds. So I've just restored a complete setup. I previously applied the workload and the state. And I can interact with that. So I use bytectl connect KCD restore, which is the name of the cluster. bytectl put out the kubeconfig here. I'm gonna switch into a new terminal. Export this as the kubeconfig. And just drop in, or we might look at the nodes. And we see we still have our 3 nodes, a server and the 2 agents which have been restored. I'm gonna drop again into K9s. I see the PostgreSQL and our application pod are running. And now I'm gonna drop into the pod again, into a shell plus. And I'm gonna list all those components. And I see our KCD component right here, which is, in fact, the very component I just previously created in the previous cluster, which I deleted. So this is a very basic and given a very nerdy application. There's no fancy front end because I'm a back end and Kubernetes specialist, so I don't do front ends. But I hope what you have seen is that we quickly spun up a cluster, deleted it before that, applied some state, stored that state, and restored it in a new cluster, which is like really effortless and amazing if you ask me. And if you want to try it out, you can do those steps on your own. So you can fiddle around with the desktop app. It's free for use. So yeah, let's drop right back into my presentation. This was the part about the free clusters, the demo application. Yeah, to just wrap things up, what I've just said, GetDeck makes it possible to easily and quickly create, restore, delete, and shelve Kubernetes clusters. There is the free GetDeck as a service offering. And if you use it, please give us feedback, even if something doesn't work as expected. If you have some feature requests, we want to be community-driven with our open source software. Again, you can find us on GitHub, and as Andreas mentioned, we also do a podcast called Tools for the Craft, which we also did an extended episode on basically the tool GetDeck, so you might want to check out that. And there is a small web page we run, which is called kubernetes.world, which is basically some form of link dump. You can also find the slides there. Yeah, here's also a QR code, which basically stands for questions and response. If somebody got questions, fire away. Yeah. We got you first.
And we also have a mic runner. Where is the...
Who is first? Sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and the shirt.
So actually, I was half expecting to hear a presentation with VMs because you said virtualization, but I wanted to ask, does this software support running the different Kubernetes clusters in different namespaces or user namespaces, or separation of the networks of the clusters that are running on it?
Well, I might quickly show you what it looks like in the host cluster. Maybe that answers your questions. If we drop into K9s here, we see a bunch of stuff that's running, and our cluster, which is the KCD restore, is running here in its own namespace with the stateful sets. So basically, we can build on that. Currently, there's no extended features in that regard. Our open source software is non-funded, so we kind of need to manage to find some time for that. But stuff like you mentioned could absolutely be possible.
Thank you.
We got down here.
So I'm wondering, imagine you are in a state of a cluster, let's say a K3s cluster. I think you showed that in the notes, and so you leave it, in the safe state for a long time, and in the meantime, a control plane certificate expires. What happens when you try to restore such a cluster?
Oh, I don't think I've run into that scenario. That's an interesting one. Yeah, I keep that in mind and gonna try it out. Thank you for that.
There's another one, Katharina, about 4 rows back from you.
Yeah. Thank you for the talk. First question is, the offering that you showed is for the SaaS platform. If you run it on yourself, on your own cluster, do you also have limitations there on how many clusters you can run?
No, you don't have limitations. So you can, with the Bible CTL, I can quickly show it to you. If we run Bible CTL install, it provides a bunch of Kubernetes manifests, which you can just install in the cluster. There's a config map where you can configure such things as those lifetimes. But you're not limited to anything there except your own infrastructure, of course.
Okay, thank you. And the second question would be go in the same direction actually as the other one. We highly rely on JWT's service accounts to authorize to cloud provider IAMs. And what kind of JWT, or how do you issue the JWTs? Because I think with vClusters, you have 2 options, either to use kind of the host cluster issuing the service accounts, whereas you can also have it that you really have the virtual cluster with a completely different issuer, CA, sign the tokens.
Yeah, and another very good point which we didn't run into ourselves. So I'm afraid I can't really give you a direct answer to that, but that's a very, very good point. You have interesting points.
Hi. What is the scaling limitations of the K3s, especially with the storage backend SQLite?
The scaling limitations, so you mean the number of nodes you can have in your virtual cluster? Number of objects?
Yeah.
Oh, I did not run into that myself yet. You're a great audience. You have amazing questions.
I saw you running K3s in the virtual cluster, right? Do you
Yes.
support already or plan to support all SADA distributions?
We prepared the code for other distributions, but currently it's not implemented. So of course we don't like make a lot of money or make any money with those tools, so we're kind of limited. But we are prepared to support other solutions there.
Do you encourage people to contribute to your project?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So it's open source. You can use it. You can give us feedback. You can also get in contact with us if you're like, well, this is a great solution, but we need another provider, and we can talk about how we could implement that, or if you could support in any way, even financially support in any way. So yeah, please contribute or get in touch in any way, or with any thoughts, with any requests you might have.
Thank you for the talk. How do you install core DNS into your virtualized Kubernetes cluster?
How do we install it? Does it come with K3s already? Yes, it does.
Yeah, with K8s, it's included. With K3s, I guess you have to install it externally.
Yeah, I think it's, or it can be managed, so I would have to look into our code, how we manage on that if we need to explicitly install it. But if we're looking into our cluster, we can, or we might have seen, it is obviously installed in here, but I would have to look into the code to answer that question.
Thank you.
Anything else, folks? By the way, good name, Beiboot, right? Sidecar, Beiboot, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We also learned that drinking from time to time some water will fix your demo. Yeah. There's a question on the front here, first row.
I would be curious, how much shelf space do I get? So how many clusters am I allowed to shelf?
This would probably depend on the provider where you're running your host cluster, because what the Kubernetes volume snapshot API is doing in the background, it is communicating with the provider, their drivers for that, and probably there's limitations on that front.
And one question from my side. So you have used this obviously with your clients from Blue Shoe. Any type of, because there are a lot of questions on kind of what if I shelf it for a long time, some sizing and you know, performance questions. Any reference projects that you can tell us on where this is used?
Well, one big customer of ours is OFA Bamberg, which is based in Germany. They do some kind of medical socks and stuff, and we use it for our development there. And it is, well, not the super complex setup, but of course a lot of state in there, the database and media assets. And if I want to set this up on my own, it will take probably half an hour, something like that. And with the get deck, with the Beiboot CTL, you saw it, I have my setup ready in 1 minute, which is a huge time saver for me and saves me a lot of hassle. So it's kind of my personal experience. I absolutely love to use something like that in contrast to what I did before to set up my development setup.
Awesome. So we are at 11:14, 1 minute early for lunch break. Before I release you to lunch break, if there's any more questions, you will be lingering around here or downstairs, right?
Yeah.
Enjoy lunch. Also, remember, check out all the sponsors, also those very back in the hall. And if you have not yet registered for the evening event, there's still a couple of slots available. So please do so, because otherwise we have to drink all the beer. And then we'll see what happens tomorrow. Okay, big round of applause again, and thanks.
Thank you. You've been a great audience. Great questions.